The truth is, most people misunderstand this. They believe that their identity is a tapestry woven from dreams, intellect, and soul. Yet they fail to recognize the heavy, pulsating reality that underpins every heartbeat. We are, before anything else, a biological machine of bone and gristle. In David Salay's visceral and unflinching novel, Flesh, the reader is dragged into the humid, sensory-laden world of Paul, a London estate agent whose existence is a relentless tribute to the material. Paul does not live in the world of metaphors or high ideals, he lives in the world of textures, of the resistance of skin, the saltiness of sweat, and the primal satisfaction of a well-cooked meal. He is a man defined not by what he thinks, but by what he consumes and what he touches. The narrative unfolds like a clinical autopsy of a midlife crisis, where the protagonist attempts to stave off the creeping dread of mortality by immersing himself in the immediate, cooling relief of carnal pleasure. He navigates the streets of London like a predator in a concrete jungle, his eyes constantly scanning for the next surface to possess, the next piece of flesh to validate his own thinning grip on youth. Whether he is negotiating a property deal or a casual tryst, the currency is always the same, the tangible. Salay's prose is microscopically detailed, focusing on the pores of a woman's neck, the grease on a plate of roast pork, and the rhythmic, almost mechanical nature of sexual encounters that leave the participants more isolated than before they began. This is the portrait of a man who has traded his spirit for his senses, only to find that the senses are a cruel and demanding master, offering only a fleeting reprieve from the silence of the soul. The psychological weight of Paul's journey serves as a harrowing meditation on the limits of modern hedonism. In a society that has largely decoupled sex and consumption from meaning, Paul is the logical extreme, a man who tries to eat and love his way out of a spiritual vacuum. The narrative suggests that when we reduce ourselves to mere biological entities, we lose the very thing that makes us human, the ability to transcend our bodies. Paul's obsession with the physical is not a celebration of life, but a desperate defense mechanism against the realization that his body is slowly but surely betraying him. The lesson here is the futility of the material fix. No matter how many bodies he occupies or how much expensive wine he drinks, the internal void remains unfillable because it is a metaphysical hunger, not a physical one. By focusing entirely on the flesh, Paul becomes a stranger to his own internal life, a man who knows the price of everything and the value of nothing. Salay forces the reader to confront the discomfort of our own animal nature, reminding us that without a higher purpose, we are simply meat in a suit, waiting for the inevitable decay. This segment of the story is a cold, hard look at the biological trap, where the pursuit of pleasure becomes the ultimate form of self-alienation. The more Paul touches, the less he feels, as his sensory receptors become dulled by overstimulation, leaving him in a state of permanent, restless dissatisfaction. As the narrative moves forward, the theme of physical entropy begins to overshadow the initial thrill of the hunt. Paul is no longer just a consumer of life, he is a witness to its decomposition. He visits a friend in the hospital, a man who was once a titan of industry and vitality, now reduced to a jaundiced, shriveled figure beneath white sheets. The descriptions are unsparing, the smell of antiseptic, the translucent quality of dying skin, the mechanical wheeze of a ventilator. In this chamber of death, Paul's philosophy of the flesh hits a wall of absolute reality. He looks at his friend and sees his own future, a pile of failing organs and fading memories. This encounter is not met with deep empathy or spiritual awakening, but with a visceral, almost nauseating recoil. Paul's inability to process the suffering of others is a direct result of his devotion to the body. If the body is everything, then a broken body is a total failure, a thing to be discarded and forgotten. He leaves the hospital and immediately seeks out a heavy meal and a casual encounter, trying to wash off the stench of mortality with the fluids of life. But the shadow has been cast. He begins to notice the small betrayals of his own frame, the slight breathlessness when climbing stairs, the softening of his jawline, the way the light catches the grey in his hair. London itself begins to reflect this decay, transformed from a playground of luxury into a vast, rotting organism where millions of bodies are grinding against one another in a doomed attempt to ignore the clock. This part of the script analyzes the shadow of the flesh, the inescapable fact that a life built on physical prowess is a life built on a foundation of sand. Paul's horror at his friend's illness reveals the inherent selfishness of the hedonist. Because he has no concept of a soul that survives the body. He views death not as a transition, but as a grotesque malfunction. The story teaches us that our obsession with youth and physical perfection is a form of collective insanity. A denial of the very cycle that defines us. Paul's reaction to decay, to double down on consumption, is the addict's response. He hopes that by adding more flesh to his life, he can somehow outweigh the void. However, the narrative suggests that the opposite is true. The more we cling to the material, the heavier the burden of loss becomes. The lesson learned is that true resilience requires a connection to something that doesn't rot. Paul's tragedy is that he has forgotten how to look for it. He is trapped in the horizontal plane of existence, unable to look up, and as a result, he is crushed by the gravity of his own biology. The intensity of the story ramps up as Paul's relationships begin to crumble under the weight of his own emptiness, proving that when two people meet only as flesh, they can never truly meet at all. The disintegration of Paul's social world accelerates as his fleshly connections prove to be as fragile as the skin they are made of. His interactions with women become increasingly transactional. Stripped of even the pretense of romance, he finds himself in a room with a beautiful woman. But instead of desire, he feels a strange, cold detachment, as if he is observing two biological specimens through a microscope. He notices the imperfections, the tiny wrinkles, the way the fat sits on the hip, and he feels a surge of profound boredom. This is the satiation point, where the seeker has had so much of what he thought he wanted that it has lost all meaning. The narrative describes a particularly bleak encounter where the physical act of love is reduced to a series of grunts and friction, leaving Paul staring at the ceiling, wondering when he became a ghost in his own house. His work as an estate agent, selling houses that are essentially just shells for other bodies to inhabit, mirrors his internal state. He is a salesman of surfaces. He begins to see the people around him as walking meat, a term that haunts the narrative with its nihilistic precision. Even his relationship with his own daughter is tainted by this perspective. He looks at her and sees a younger version of the biological cycle, a person who will eventually face the same decay he is currently fighting. There is no warmth in this realization, only a grim, scientific acceptance. The psychological analysis of this decay focuses on the isolation of the materialist. By denying the existence of the self beyond the body, Paul has effectively locked himself in a sensory deprivation tank of his own making. He cannot experience love because love requires a vulnerability that goes deeper than the dermis. He cannot experience joy because joy is a spiritual state, while he only understands pleasure, which is a neurological one. The lesson here is that our bodies are meant to be the vessels of our lives, not the destination. When the vessel becomes the focus, the journey stops. Paul's life has become a stagnant pond, and the stench of that stagnation is beginning to overwhelm him. The story illustrates that the flesh is a gatekeeper. If you cannot move past it, you will never reach the garden. The tension in the narrative moves toward a final, silent collapse, where the weight of the material becomes too much for the protagonist to bear. He is a man who has won the world of the senses and lost the ability to feel anything at all. The script now moves toward the final part of the story, where the ultimate consequence of a life of flesh is revealed in its most naked, unadorned form, leading to a powerful realization about the nature of the human condition in a godless, material age. The narrative continues, describing Paul's final descent into a state of functional nihilism. He continues to eat, to work, and to seek out bodies, but he does so with the mechanical precision of a clock. He has become the very thing he feared, a biological process without a purpose. The final movement of the script will address the total stripping of Paul's ego and the haunting, quiet conclusion of the book, which offers no easy answers, only a stark, unforgettable image of what it means to be truly alone in one's own skin. This segment also explores the urban flesh of London, the way the city itself acts as a massive digestive system, consuming and excreting its inhabitants. Salay's portrayal of the city as a biological entity reinforces the idea that Paul is just a cell in a much larger, equally mindless organism. The psychological pressure of the crowd is not a pressure of community, but a pressure of competing biomass. This adds a layer of social commentary to the personal tragedy, suggesting that our modern, secular cities are designed for the flesh, making the survival of the spirit nearly impossible. The final part will tie these threads together, delivering the core message and the final one-liner that defines the book's legacy as a masterpiece of contemporary realism and existential dread. The terminal phase of Paul's journey into the absolute material world unfolds as a quiet, rhythmic surrender to the inevitable. There is no grand epiphany, no sudden religious conversion, and no dramatic act of self-destruction. Instead, there is the hollow, echoing sound of a life that has been completely hollowed out by its own appetites. The narrative follows Paul as he moves through the grey, wintry streets of London, a city that now feels like a vast, cold abattoir where the only thing being processed is time. He finds himself in the company of a woman he barely knows, engaging in the same repetitive rituals of consumption and carnal contact. But the veil has been entirely lifted. He no longer sees a person, he sees a system of pulleys and levers, of blood flow and nerve endings. He looks at his own hands and sees them as strange, alien appendages, meat that is tasked with moving other meat. The psychological intensity of this final segment lies in the absolute desacralization of the world. By successfully stripping away every layer of mystery, every hint of the divine, and every whisper of the soul, Paul has achieved a state of total, unadulterated truth. But it is a truth that is impossible to live with. It is the truth of the void. He realizes that when you win the war of the senses, the prize is a profound and terminal boredom. This closing arc of the novel serves as a devastating critique of the scientific materialist worldview when applied to the intimacy of a human life. Paul's tragedy is not that he is a bad man, he is, in fact, an average man, but that he is a man who has lost the capacity for awe. The narrative suggests that the flesh is not just a biological reality, it is a boundary that can only be crossed through the imagination and the spirit. Without those elements, every touch is just friction, and every meal is just fuel. The lesson learned here is that the enchantment of the world is not a luxury, but a biological necessity for the spirit. When we treat our bodies and the bodies of others as mere objects, we become objects ourselves. Paul has become objectified by his own philosophy. He is a ghost in a machine that he no longer cares to operate. This part of the story emphasizes the weight of the ordinary, the way a life without meaning becomes a physical burden, a heaviness in the limbs that no amount of exercise or pleasure can alleviate. The narrative reaches its conclusion with Paul sitting alone in a sterile, modern apartment, surrounded by the high-end materials he spent his life selling. Realizing that he is simply a biological clock ticking towards zero in a room full of expensive shadows. The psychological analysis of the final pages focuses on the nihilism of the body. David Szalay demonstrates that if we are only flesh, then our lives are essentially a joke with a cruel punchline. We are born to hunger, we struggle to eat, and then we are eaten. Paul's journey is a microcosm of a secular age that has perfected the cure for pain but has forgotten the cause for joy. The story reveals that the body-centric life is a closed loop, it offers nowhere to go but down. By the end of the book, the reader is left with a sense of profound existential vertigo. We have looked so deeply into the pores and the fluids of human existence that we have lost sight of the face. The lesson is that we must find a way to sacralize our existence, to see the person within the flesh, or we risk becoming the very walking meat that haunted Paul's dreams. The novel is an uncomfortable, essential mirror, reflecting a world where we are increasingly connected by technology but remains fundamentally skin to skin, and yet, somehow, miles apart. The core message and meaning that Flesh intends to convey to readers is that a life lived strictly within the confines of biological gratification and material reality is a life that eventually collapses under its own weight. It serves as a stark warning that when we reduce human experience to its most basic physical components, sex, food, and the avoidance of pain, we strip away the very essence of what makes life endurable. Szalay suggests that the flesh is a trap if it is not animated by something greater than itself. It is a landscape of beauty that turns into a landscape of horror the moment we realize it is temporary. The book is a meditation on the loneliness of the materialist, proving that the most profound isolation is not being alone in a room, but being alone in one's own body, unable to reach past the skin to touch the soul of another. It is a call to recognize the transcendental necessity, the idea that for flesh to be anything more than meat, it must be the vessel for a spirit that refuses to be defined by its eventual decay. We are not merely the skin that contains us, but the light that struggles to break through it.